Now back to the Washington Post. Its article is at least in part a report about the report at WJLA News. And that report about the report said that the situation related to the proposed legislation by Delegate Guzman, it had faced a very new reality because of the TV report in which Guzman said that she had been misrepresented. She called the report inaccurate. The Washington Post is, of course, writing from the left, and it's very LGBTQ plus affirming. Its report says this, quote, Guzman's measure speaks only to physical or mental abuse inflicted on a child. There's no mention of gender-affirming medical treatments, although some Republicans suggested that parents might be accused of inflicting emotional abuse if they are not supportive of their child's LGBTQ identity, end quote. Well, where did that idea come from? And I would suggest it probably came from reading the actual proposed legislation, which I did, and I have the legislation before me. The original language, going back to 2020, says that it is a felony violation of Virginia law if a parent or other person responsible for his, meaning the minor's care, creates or inflicts, threatens to create or inflict, or allows to be created or inflicted upon such child a physical or mental injury on the basis of the child's gender identity or sexual orientation. Now, that's the statement. And just understand that you don't have to look at any kind of legal textbook in order to get the very clear picture of what's going on here. Because when you're talking about physical or mental health, and when mental health, including by the profession that is represented by this legislator, when that profession says that an unwillingness to affirm is a form of harm, then you don't have to read between the lines. This particular issue is right here in the text. And if you doubt it, let me read to you from Section 2 on the first page of the proposed legislation. And this is the 2020 text. It would define as a felony violation if a parent or other person responsible for a minor, quote, neglects or refuses to provide care necessary for his health, end quote. Very interesting, because you know exactly what that's talking about, because that is exactly the argument about so-called gender-affirming surgery or hormone treatment. When you talk about what medical providers increasingly define as necessary for the health of those who declare themselves non-binary or gender non-conforming or transgender, then this is exactly what we're talking about. The legislation goes on, and here's where the exception language proves the point demonstrably and horrifyingly. Quote, however, no child who in good faith is under treatment solely by spiritual means through prayer in accordance with the tenets and practices of a recognized church or religious denomination shall for that reason alone be considered to be an abused or neglected child, end quote. You'll notice the key word there is alone. In other words, that kind of religious teaching, that kind of religious conviction could very much be a part. It just can't be the only factor that might constitute evidence of a crime. Quote, further, a decision by parents who have legal authority for the child, or in the absence of parents with legal authority for the child, any person with legal authority for the child who refuses a particular medical treatment for a child with a life-threatening condition shall not be deemed a refusal to provide necessary care if, 1, such decision is made jointly by the parents or other person with legal authority and the child. 2, the child has reached 14 years of age and is sufficiently mature to have an informed opinion on the subject of his medical treatment. 3, the parents or other person with legal authority and the child have considered alternative treatment options. And 4, the parents or other person with legal authority and the child believe in good faith that such decision is in the child's best interest. End quote. Just consider what we just heard there. Notice the language about a life-threatening condition, and then go back to the language being used right now in terms of the arguments about the morality of harm that are now directed towards parents, cultural authorities, educators, preachers, pastors, and others who cannot join the transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming, LGBTQ plus revolution. Just recall the fact that the LGBTQ plus and especially the transgender activist community are openly claiming, with the support of many so-called medical professionals, that a refusal to cooperate with or to support or to allow what is in Orwellian doublespeak called gender-affirming surgery, which means removing the anatomy of a male in order to appear as a female, or removing the anatomy of a female to appear as a male, that is now presented as a threat to life and health. Don't believe any legislator, any media authority, or any cultural influencer who tells you, oh, that doesn't have anything to do with subverting the rights and authority of parents. It is actually a threat to criminalize parents for being parents. The television station has, by the way, put up now the entire record of the 20-minute conversation with the legislator, and yet you have the actual documentation by transcript of what's going on here. For example, the legislator, Elizabeth Guzman, actually explained to the television reporter Nick Minnick this, quote, if the child shares with those mandated reporters what they are going through, we're talking about not only physical abuse or mental abuse. She went on to say the job of that mandated reporter is to inform Child Protective Services. Quote, and then that's how everybody gets involved. There's also an investigation in place that is not only from a social worker, but there's also a police investigation before we make the decision that there's going to be a CPS, that is Child Protective Services, charge. The reporter then asked her, quote, what could the penalties be if the investigation concludes that a parent is not affirming of their LGBTQ child? What could the consequences be? The legislator answered, and please hear these words clearly, quote, well, we first have to complete an investigation. It could be a felony. It could be a misdemeanor. But we know that CPS charge could harm your employment, could harm their education, because nowadays many people do a CPS database search before offering employment. End quote. Do you hear the threat there? The threat there is not only in terms of a criminal charge, either a misdemeanor or a felony, but also of making certain that parents in this case become effectively unemployable. The reporter also asked the legislator if she was not concerned that this would infringe upon free speech or religious freedom. And then the reporter said, what do you tell those parents who might be learning about this bill who don't feel like they want to necessarily affirm what their children are feeling when it comes to their sexual orientation or gender identity? The legislator answered the question, quote, I've been asked that question by knocking on doors. The Bible says to accept everyone for who they are, so that's what I tell them when they ask me that question, and that's what I will continue to tell people, end quote. You'll notice that what's not here is any affirmation of religious liberty, any acknowledgement of Christian conviction, or any acknowledgement of the rights of parents, incontrovertibly denied here. She instead just misrepresents the Bible by saying, quote, the Bible says to accept everyone for who they are, end quote. That is profoundly not what the Bible says. The Bible points us to love of neighbor and respect for all, and the understanding that every single human being is made in the image of God and thus has the sanctity of life and has dignity, but it doesn't say that we must accept everyone for who they say they are. Now, going back to the Washington Post article, one of the interesting things we need to note is that many Democrats, and so far as I can tell, just all the Republicans that have been cited here, but many Democrats, including Democratic leaders in the legislature there in Virginia, they don't want any part of this bill. At least they don't want any part of this bill the way it's written, and they don't want any part of it for now. How long do you expect that to last? One of the big lessons of the election of Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin just a matter of a year ago, one of the big lessons in that Virginia election was that parents aren't going to put up with their rights and their integrity being questioned. They are not going to turn their children over to the state as wards of the state. We'll continue to follow this story, but I want us to recognize this isn't just about Virginia. It's about the entire nation. It's about the inevitable logic of the moral revolutionaries. It's about the fact that parents are nearly universally understood in the LGBTQ activist community as the great obstacle that have to be overcome if that revolution is to press forward. And you also understand, and there's a certain amount of not only radical ideology, but what can only be described as moral insanity here. There's an incredible focus on pushing the transgender agenda down age to as young an age as possible. Given the process of physical and sexual maturation in the human being, I think we can understand why that is so. We can understand why the agenda is so absolutely transparent, increasingly as we understand the way they argue about a morality of harm, saying that a failure to affirm is a form of harm. Now you have the threat of child abuse charges being brought against parents explicitly when it comes to their own offspring or to children under their care. You see the direct threat that this legislation represents, and we have to understand that what is remarkable here is not the agenda, but the accidental and rather embarrassing candor with which this agenda was made transparent. There's going to be more to this story. We'll be following this story with you. I can only hope that every single Christian church, Christian leader, and Christian parent understands what is at stake here. This is now something real. You can find it yourself in the proposed legislation. And just keep in mind that when some people say, oh, don't worry, this legislation doesn't have a chance, well, that's been said about an awful lot of legislation that got its chance very quickly.